And welcome to another Tuesday with the Disability Policy for All. Today we have the great fortune to be talking to Andy Imparato, who is the Executive Director here at the Association for University Centers on Disability, AUCD. We're going to be talking to Andy about the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court's fight with a new justice. So welcome, Andy.
Thank you, Liz. Great to be here.
Can you explain to our viewers what is the Supreme Court and why is it so important?
Sure. So the Supreme Court of the United States is the body that interprets the U.S. Constitution and the laws, the federal laws that Congress passes. And it also has oversight of what the executive branch does, so what the Obama administration does to make sure that what they're doing is consistent with the Constitution and with federal laws. And, you know, people talk about how our democracy has three kind of co-equal branches of government. So we have the executive branch, which is charged with implementing laws. We have the legislative branch, Congress, which passes the laws. And then we have the judicial branch, which interprets the laws. So if the President of the United States is the head of the executive branch, the Supreme Court is the head of the judicial branch. So all the other federal courts have to follow what the Supreme Court says. You have 9 justices on the Supreme Court. They're all appointed for life. So, you know, they're independent. They can make decisions and don't necessarily face any political consequences for the decisions. So it's a very powerful group of 9 people who, you know, decide some of the most important things. You remember the Affordable Care Act, you know, it went up to the Supreme Court to see whether what Congress did was okay under the Constitution. There was an important case involving whether it was okay to apply the death penalty to people with intellectual disabilities under the Constitution. We've had a number of cases interpreting the Americans with Disabilities Act. So it's a very important body that kind of sets the rules for what's okay for Congress to do and for the administration to do.
Okay, thank you. As we have learned recently, a justice has passed away, and I'm sorry about that. Why is there a fight to fill his seat?
So when a judge either dies or retires, one of the most important things the president gets to do is appoint the next justice to the Supreme Court, and they do that under the Constitution with the advice and consent of the Senate, meaning that once they nominate the person, the Senate has a hearing in the Judiciary Committee and then ultimately has a vote on whether they're going to confirm the person. So with Justice Scalia passing, this is a particularly important moment in the history of the Supreme Court because Justice Scalia has been part of a 5-justice majority. So when it's a divided court, oftentimes it's 5 on one side, 4 on another side. He's been one of the strongest and most consistent conservative voices on the court. For President Obama to have an opportunity to replace him could change the balance on the court, and the person that is appointed to replace him may end up making the deciding vote on some of these close decisions in the other direction. So it could mean a more generous interpretation of civil rights laws. It could be good for the Affordable Care Act in terms of future challenges to that. You know, it can affect environmental decisions. It can affect a wide range of issues that come in front of the Supreme Court.
Okay. How is the decision filled the court seat related to the upcoming presidential election?
So you probably saw when Justice Scalia passed, immediately there were Republican voices like the majority leader in the Senate, Mitch McConnell, saying President Obama should not nominate the successor. We should wait until after the outcome of the election. And then the president also quickly said I'm going to fulfill my constitutional duties and nominate the successor. So this is positioning that could result in a significant political battle about, is it too close to the election to nominate and confirm a new justice? Should we wait for the election, see what the outcome is, and let the new president do that? Or no, in fact, if we look at the precedents, this is not the first time that we've had an opportunity to nominate somebody during the last year of a presidential term, and we should follow those precedents, and President Obama should fulfill his constitutional responsibilities and nominate a successor. So that's kind of the fight. Interestingly, Justice O'Connor, a Republican appointee, weighed in yesterday that she thought that President Obama should go ahead and nominate someone, and that it's important to have a full complement on the court, and they shouldn't wait until after the election.
And we don't even know what is the outcome. A Democrat can win, and we will assume. I'm assuming, by the way you're talking, that the appointed Democrats.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. It's a Republican Senate, so some would argue that President Obama would be motivated to appoint somebody moderate who has a decent chance of getting confirmed by a Republican Senate. If you wait until after the election, there's a chance that the Senate will go from being a Republican majority to being a Democratic majority, and there's a chance that we'll have a new Democratic president. Under that scenario, they may not have the same motivation to appoint a moderate, although generally, you're going to need some Republican votes to get to 60 votes, which you need to get a floor vote. So there's a motivation to appoint a moderate under any scenario. But some could argue if we waited till after the election and the Senate becomes Democratic, it would be a more friendly environment to somebody that is further to the left.
Okay, thanks. What are some of the disability or civil rights issues that the Supreme Court is likely to face in the future?
Well, I think one of the most significant things that the Supreme Court does is interpret the Constitution. So if you think about one of the most famous cases in the history of the Supreme Court was Brown versus Board of Education, which was the case that said that having a separate, but quote-unquote separate but equal school, where black children went to a school where all the other children were black, and white children went to schools where all the other children were white, the Supreme Court in 1954 said that's not okay under the Equal Protection Clause of the Constitution. So that was a pretty significant case that dramatically changed, what was going on in public education in this country. If you look at the way the Supreme Court has interpreted things like the Equal Protection Clause in the Constitution, which is one of the most important parts of the Constitution for civil rights, the idea that all of us have the right to have equal protection under the law and to be treated fairly and not to be discriminated against on the basis of race or disability or gender or any other religion, any other protected class. The interpretation of the Constitution in the area of disability has not been very good. I would argue that we really haven't had a Brown versus Board of Education type decision in disability. To me, the most significant advancement in our field was the Americans with Disabilities Act, which was a congressional thing, not a Supreme Court thing. And the Supreme Court cases interpreting the ADA kind of went out of their way to narrow the scope of who was protected by the law. So I don't know if you remember, but for a while there were people with mental illness, with epilepsy, with diabetes, with lots of conditions that they could manage with medication. The courts were saying, because you can manage your condition, we're not going to consider you a person with a disability, so we don't have to reach the issue of whether you were discriminated against. So we had lots of cases getting thrown out of court on the issue of whether people were disabled enough to have civil rights protections. And we had to go back to Congress to overturn all of those Supreme Court decisions. So I think, for us, when we think about the future of the court, we're looking for justices who can really see the direct connection between disability and other civil rights categories, and read the Constitution in a way that provides robust protections for our civil rights. You know, you could argue one of the most important cases for us was the Olmstead decision that said it can be a violation of the ADA for people to have to be served in segregated settings. And we've been able to use Olmstead, especially under the Obama administration, to challenge state Medicaid programs that are pushing people into institutions and segregated settings. But if you actually read that decision, it's a relatively weak decision. The court gives the state lots of things that they can argue to justify why they're spending more money in institutions. So the progress that we've seen since '99, when that decision came down, has been relatively slow. As you know, we still have institutions. There still is an institutional bias in the Medicaid program. If we had a stronger interpretation of the Constitution and a stronger interpretation of the ADA, we would see progress faster. So to me, that's what's at stake. We need justices who understand disability as an important part of civil rights, and who are going to have the same kind of passion in thinking about disability issues that we saw from Thurgood Marshall in thinking about race discrimination, or Ruth Bader Ginsburg in thinking about discrimination on the basis of gender. We need a champion on the Supreme Court. Even the liberal justices have not been consistently good on disability issues.
Thank you. Is there anything else that you would like to share with our viewers on this topic?
Well, I think the one thing that I think anytime there's a Supreme Court nomination, it's an opportunity to re-educate the Senate on how the Supreme Court has been for our community. So talking to the Senate about some of these bad decisions that we've gotten from the Supreme Court, trying to get the members of the Judiciary Committee to ask disability questions during the confirmation hearings, assuming that we have confirmation hearings. We had some success on that when President Bush nominated Roberts and nominated Alito. A number of Democrats and Republicans on the Senate Judiciary Committee asked how they would apply disability, kind of what their philosophy was in the area of disability rights. So we had some success there. We did not see the same kind of questions with Justice Sotomayor or Justice Kagan. So one of the opportunities I think we have is to start writing to our senators and encouraging them to, when they have the opportunity to ask questions, either as the nominees come around and make the rounds and meet with senators, or if they're on the Judiciary Committee as part of the confirmation hearings, to make sure that disability issues are brought up as part of the conversation.
Okay, thank you. If you have any questions about this or any other issues, any other policy issues, please go to the AUCD webpage and look for this week's In Brief. And if you have any questions or comments about this week's Tuesdays with Liz, please leave them in the space below. Thank you and have a nice day. Thanks, Andy, very much.
Thanks, Liz.